A single drop of clear fluid falling onto the dirt in first century Jerusalem.
Right.
According to the source we are unpacking today, that one microscopic event, that single drop of fluid, is the exact center point of like 250,000 miles of metaphorical roads.
It is a staggering claim, really.
Yeah, we are looking at a text that takes just a handful of agonizing hours on a Friday afternoon and claims that everything from ancient Roman city planning to a frantic race against a ticking clock to, obscure ancient heresies.
Oh, and even an intricate, almost cinematic reversal of a famous Egyptian play.
Yes, all of that violently colliding in this one single moment.
It completely shifts how you read historical or religious material. I mean, usually human history feels inherently chaotic. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Just totally random.
You look at ancient literature and you expect a scatter plot. A battle here, a random philosophical movement there, maybe a royal decree.
Right, just a bunch of disconnected events.
Exactly. But today's material proposes the exact opposite. It argues for a master blueprint where the structural engineering basically holds every seemingly isolated incident together.
And that structural engineering is exactly what we are examining in today's deep dive. We have a really fascinating, highly detailed source today.
We do. It's a sermon transcript from April 2026.
Yep. By Pastor Stephen Wilhoit at Dwell City Church, titled "The Work is Finished." And the mission of this deep dive is to unpack the really dense, multi-layered theological blueprint Wilhoit draws around the crucifixion of Jesus.
Specifically focusing on a few verses in the Gospel of John, chapter 19.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. Because Wilhoit actually starts his argument not in Jerusalem, but in the heart of ancient Rome.
Yeah, he brings up a very specific physical piece of architecture.
The golden milestone.
That's the one. In 20 BC, the Emperor Augustus erected a monument called the Militarium Aureum right in the center of the Roman Forum.
And modern cities often use, like, north-south grid systems, but Rome wasn't like that?
No, Rome was designed more like a bicycle wheel. You had a central hub with spokes radiating outward.
Wow, okay.
From that golden milestone, an estimated 250,000 miles of paved roads spiderwebbed across the entire Roman Empire.
That is just a massive network.
Oh, stretching deep into Europe and beyond. It was literally point zero. That's actually where the famous phrase originates. All roads lead to Rome.
Oh, no way. I never realized that was a literal physical thing.
Yeah. No matter where you stood on that vast network, if you just kept walking toward the center, you'd eventually hit that exact stone monument.
And Wilhoit uses this as his core lens for biblical theology. He argues that the Bible's texts, its ancient purity laws, all those bizarre rituals, and the prophecies, they aren't just a random collection of moral fables.
Right. He views it as a hyper-intentional architectural system.
A network of literary and historical roads that all deliberately point to one singular center, the person and work of Christ. And to prove how intentional this is, he points to the concept of restricted access.
Which is super prevalent in these texts. Think about the overarching narrative from the very beginning. In the Garden of Eden, humanity rebels, and they are expelled.
But the author doesn't just describe, like, a polite eviction.
Not at all. The text explicitly mentions angels wielding flaming swords stationed at the entrance. It is a severe physical keep-out sign.
Which, theologically speaking, means that absolute holiness is fundamentally incompatible with corruption, right?
Exactly. If something impure gets too close to the divine presence, it is consumed.
And the tension is that humanity desperately wants access, but the architecture of the universe actively prevents it, and that barrier concept, it just keeps evolving.
Yeah, like when the Israelites build the tabernacle in the desert.
Right, and centuries later, the permanent temple in Jerusalem, the blueprints read like a series of increasingly restricted security zones.
You have an outer court for the general public, an inner area just for specific priests, the holy place.
And finally, the absolute center, the most holy place.
And that inner sanctum was practically a fortress of purification rituals. A person couldn't just casually stroll in.
Only one man could, right, the high priest.
And only on one specific day a year. He had to be enveloped in a cloud of incense to obscure his vision so he wouldn't instantly die.
That is so intense.
It is. And Wilhoit's argument is that all these boundaries, the swords, the heavy curtains, the meticulous rules, were established to communicate a terrifying reality.
You can come this close, but no further.
Exactly. However, he posits that the event on the cross represents the violent tearing down of that barrier. The road is finally open all the way to the golden milestone.
You know, reading Wilhoit's breakdown, it really reminds me of getting to the end of a massively complex fantasy novel series.
Oh, like when everything finally clicks together.
Yes. You're deep into book 7, and the protagonist uses some bizarre magical object to save the day, and you suddenly realize the author planted that seemingly irrelevant Easter egg way back in chapter 2 of book 1.
That is a great analogy.
Right. In literary terms, authors sometimes use retroactive continuity or retconning, where they go back and invent new facts to make old plot holes make sense. But looking at Wilhoit's argument, is the speaker arguing that all these ancient laws and rituals were designed specifically to set up the mechanics of this one Friday?
We connect this to the bigger picture. Yes, that is precisely the worldview he is presenting. He firmly rejects the idea of retroactive continuity.
Okay, so he's saying it was planned from the start.
Right. He isn't saying later authors looked back at the crucifixion and desperately tried to force connections to old Jewish texts. He is arguing that the divine author engineered the entirety of human history, psychology, and religious law to culminate on this specific afternoon.
Wow. And that leads perfectly into the timing, because if everything is engineered, the when is just as critical as the what.
Oh, absolutely. The timing is everything.
This all unfolds on a Friday, which in the Jewish calendar was the day of preparation.
Because the Sabbath Saturday, the seventh day, was legally mandated as a day of absolute uncompromising rest. You couldn't do any physical labor at all.
Therefore, to actually enjoy that rest, every single chore, all the cooking, all the heavy lifting, it all had to be completely finished before the sun went down on Friday.
And Wilhoit draws a massive thematic parallel here to the opening pages of the Bible.
The Genesis creation account.
Exactly. God works for 6 days, bringing the universe into order, and on the seventh day, with the work complete, God rests.
So you have Jesus hanging on a cross on a Friday, the 6th day, the literal day of preparation.
And his final words before dying are, "It is finished."
And Wilhoit insists this isn't just a gasp of physical exhaustion from a dying man, right?
Far from it. It's a cosmic theological declaration. He is claiming to complete the ultimate work of redemption-bearing divine judgment on the 6th day.
So that humanity can finally enter into spiritual rest on the 7th.
That's the idea.
You know, this concept of rest translates so aggressively to modern life. Wilhoit actually spends a good portion of the sermon talking about how frantically we all run around today.
We are chronically exhausted.
Completely. We try to manufacture rest by securing the perfect promotion or, building untouchable financial portfolios. Or we overschedule our kids with elite activities so they'll be guaranteed a quote-unquote good life.
We are desperate for peace, but our strategy to find it is just endless grinding activity.
Yeah, and he drops this fantastic quote. If the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy.
Ouch. That highlights a really deep psychological truth. We treat those external achievements, the bank account, the status, as our personal golden milestones.
But Wilhoit suggests those roads will never provide what the Hebrew text calls shalom, right? That deep, holistic, existential peace.
Right. He's proposing that true rest isn't taking a nap on the couch. It's a spiritual state achieved only when you stop trying to justify your own existence, because you accept that the ultimate existential work has already been done for you.
Wait, hang on. If this Friday was supposed to be the inauguration of ultimate rest, that completely contradicts the reality on the ground in the historical narrative.
How so?
Well, if we look at the logistics of that afternoon in Jerusalem, it was anything but restful. It was a chaotic, blood-soaked nightmare of a scramble.
Oh, logistically, it was a complete disaster for the religious leaders, because a new Jewish day doesn't start at midnight.
Right, it begins at sundown.
Which was roughly 6 p.m.
Yeah.
And Jesus is crucified and dies around 3 p.m. That leaves a remarkably narrow 3-hour window.
And the Pharisees are panicking because of a deeply ingrained law from Deuteronomy 21.
Yes, that ancient law states that if a man is executed and hung on a tree, his body is considered a curse to God.
And if you leave that cursed body exposed overnight, it literally defiles the physical land of Israel. He absolutely must be buried the same day.
And the urgency is compounded because they aren't just rushing toward a normal weekly Sabbath. The text points out this was a high day, the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Which was the cornerstone of Jewish identity commemorating the Exodus.
Right. The historical story is that the Israelites had to escape slavery in Egypt so quickly they didn't have time to let their bread dough rise with yeast or leaven.
They grabbed flat, unleavened bread and bolted for the Red Sea, where the waters washed away their old lives of bondage.
The psychology of the leaven is fascinating here. In biblical literature, leaven almost universally represents sin, corruption, or hypocrisy.
Why yeast specifically?
Because yeast is something microscopic that you fold into dough and it quietly spreads, infecting and puffing up the entire batch. So this entire week-long festival is an obsession with purity.
Families would actually scour their homes to remove every single crumb of yeast, right?
Exactly. It's about moving fast, leaving the corrupting influence of sin behind, and stepping into a clean future.
Which exposes the profound, almost sickening irony that Will Hoyt brings to the surface. Let's look at the psychology of these religious leaders for a second.
It's a massive contradiction.
They have just spent the entire night holding illegal trials, bribing witnesses, and orchestrating the unjust execution of an innocent man. They have completely corrupted themselves.
And now, as he hangs dying, they are frantically rushing to get his bloody body out of sight before 6 p.m.
Why? So they don't violate a purity law right before a festival dedicated to leaving sin behind?
Their blind spot is just staggering. They're straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel.
It's the moral equivalent of someone speeding recklessly through a crowded school zone, endangering dozens of children, just to make sure they arrive on time to teach a pedestrian safety seminar.
That is exactly it. They are completely oblivious to the fact that their actions are actively destroying the very principles they claim to be upholding.
So, because they are so desperate to maintain their superficial ritual purity, they apply immense political pressure on the Roman governor Pilate to get the bodies buried before the sun goes down.
And that ticking clock forces the Roman guards to initiate a brutal procedure to speed up the executions. They ask for permission to break the legs of the crucified men.
Will Hoyt doesn't gloss over the horrific physical reality of this request, and, it's really important to understand why breaking legs was a standard Roman tactic.
Crucifixion didn't usually kill victims through massive blood loss. It killed them through agonizing, slow asphyxiation.
Right. Hanging by your arms pulls your chest cavity into a permanently inhaled state.
So to exhale and draw a fresh breath of air, the victim had to scrape their shredded back against the rough wood and push upward, using the nails driven through their feet or ankles.
It was an unimaginable torture of exhaustion.
Eventually, the victim's muscles would simply give out. They wouldn't have the strength to lift themselves anymore, and suffocation would follow.
So, if the soldiers needed to clear the execution site quickly before sundown, they would take a heavy iron club or a wooden mallet and basically shatter the victim's lower legs.
Without any skeletal support to push up, death by asphyxiation would occur in a matter of minutes.
The soldiers actually execute this procedure on the two criminals crucified on either side of Jesus. But when they get to the center cross, the entire narrative pivots.
Because they observe that Jesus is already dead. So they don't break his legs.
To a casual reader, this seems like a pretty minor procedural detail, maybe just a stroke of luck that spared a corpse further mutilation.
But Will Hoyt zeroes in on this as one of the most massive intersections of those theological roads we talked about earlier.
Oh, this is where Will Hoyt argues the master blueprint is most visible.
Because remember, this frantic execution is happening concurrently with the preparation for the Passover.
Right, the Passover lamb, whose blood was painted on the doorposts in Egypt to save the Israelites from the plague of death.
And that lamb had incredibly specific, non-negotiable requirements detailed in ancient texts like Exodus 12 and Numbers 9.
There are two really big rules, right? First, the lamb had to be entirely unblemished, and the text specifically mandates that not a single bone in its body could be broken.
Correct.
And second, absolutely none of its meat could be left over until the morning. Everything had to be dealt with before sunrise.
So Jesus's intact bones fulfill both that stringent Passover requirement and a very specific poetic prophecy from Psalm 34 that declares not one of his bones will be broken.
Wow.
And because the religious leaders are terrified of the Deuteronomy curse, they force the Roman soldiers to take him down the same day, ensuring there are no leftovers on the cross by morning.
So Will Hoyt's synthesis is that Jesus isn't just a tragic martyr, he is functioning, down to the actual physiological details of his skeletal structure, as the ultimate perfect Passover lamb.
Exactly.
I am looking at Will Hoyt's notes on this leftover rule, and he takes it in a fascinating direction regarding modern human behavior.
The all-or-nothing concept.
Yeah. He argues that this ancient command to leave nothing behind signifies that we must take all of Christ or nothing. The text demands total integration.
which is a tough pill to swallow today.
It is, because isn't it standard human nature to cherry pick our belief systems? We naturally curate the philosophies we engage with.
Oh, 100%.
We love pulling, like, the mindfulness techniques out of Buddhism, the emotional resilience out of ancient Stoicism, and the comforting parables out of Jesus' teachings. But we conveniently leave the heavy demands of absolute submission behind.
We absolutely operate like we are at a philosophical buffet. We want the benefits without the cost. We desire a savior who comforts us when the storm hits, but we violently resist a Lord who commands us to walk out into the deep water.
And Wilhoit is challenging that instinct directly.
He is. He argues that the fundamental architecture of this text simply doesn't allow for a cafeteria-style religion. The unbroken bones and the no leftovers rule signify an indivisible, coherent whole.
You either accept the total package, the demands, the lordship, the terrifying sacrifice, or you possess nothing at all.
You cannot dissect the golden milestone.
Okay, so Jesus has avoided having his legs broken, fulfilling the ancient Passover requirements. But that creates a massive, life-threatening legal liability for these Roman soldiers on the ground.
Because if they don't break his legs, how do they legally prove to their commanding officers that the execution was actually successful?
Roman soldiers were highly trained, professional executioners. The penalty for failing to execute a prisoner was severe.
If they released a body to the grieving family, and that person woke up 3 days later in the cool environment of a tomb because they had merely passed out from trauma.
Which would be a disaster for the soldiers.
Exactly. The soldiers responsible for the botched execution would be put to death themselves. They needed undeniable biological proof.
So to secure that proof, one of the soldiers takes a spear and thrusts it violently upward into Jesus' side. And the author of the gospel notes a highly specific detail. Blood and clear water immediately flow out of the wound.
And Wilhoit unpacks the significance of this spear thrust on 4 entirely different levels. It's basically a masterclass in how much weight a single sentence of ancient text can carry.
Let's start with the first level, the immediate physiological reality on the ground.
For a first-century Roman soldier who doesn't care about Jewish theology, seeing dark blood and clear fluid pour out of a chest cavity was the ultimate biological proof of death by asphyxiation.
Right, because modern medicine tells us that when a person dies of suffocation under extreme physical stress, massive amounts of fluid build up around the heart and lungs.
Conditions known as pericardial or pleural effusion. When the spear punctured that sac, the separated fluids drained out. It verified scientifically that the prisoner was dead.
Then Wilhoit moves to the prophetic level. He pulls in a pretty bizarre line from the ancient prophet Zechariah chapter 12, which says, "They will look on him whom they have pierced."
But the grammar there is incredibly specific.
Right, the prophecy says, whom they have pierced, plural, even though only one Roman soldier physically held the shaft of the spear.
And Wilhoit connects this to the suffering servant passage in Isaiah 53 to argue that the soldier was just the instrument. It was actually humanity's collective transgressions, our rebellion, that ultimately drove the spear.
The third level takes us deep into the philosophical battles of the ancient world, specifically pushing back against early heresies.
Wilhoit brings up a group known as the Gnostics, and more specifically, a sect that believed in Docetism.
Docetism comes from the Greek word dokio, which means to seem or to appear. So what was their core argument?
To understand the Gnostics, you have to understand ancient Greek philosophy. They drew a hard, impenetrable line between the spiritual and the physical.
They believed the spiritual realm was pure and perfect, while the material, physical world was inherently evil, corrupt, and disgusting.
Therefore, the idea that a purely divine, perfect being would inhabit a sweaty, bleeding, digesting human body was deeply offensive to them.
They argued that Jesus only appeared to be human. He was basically a divine hologram walking around the earth.
But the author of this gospel, John, is fiercely rejecting that philosophy. By including this intensely graphic detail of separated blood and water flowing from a physical wound, John is screaming to his readers across history.
No, he was not a hologram. He was fully, messily, biologically real.
John is deeply concerned with proving the physical reality of the incarnation. Wilhoit actually connects this scene to another letter written by John, 1 John chapter 5, where he writes about Jesus coming by water and blood.
Scholars argue this is a reference to the physical realities of human childbirth, right?
Exactly, the breaking of the amniotic fluid and the blood of delivery. So John creates these profound literary bookends. Jesus was born of water and blood, proving he was fully human at birth.
And he died with blood and water flowing out of his side, proving he was fully human at death. He suffered real pain in a real body.
That brings us to the fourth level, the sacramental level, or what Will refers to as the grand reversal.
This is the part that genuinely blew my mind.
What's fascinating here is how Wilhoit connects this Roman spear thrust all the way back to the very first plague of Egypt.
Wow, okay.
In the Exodus narrative, God brings judgment upon the superpower of Egypt, a nation built on the backs of slaves. The plague begins when the life-giving water of the Nile River is violently turned into blood.
Because water turning into blood is a symbol of absolute devastation. It brings death, kills the ecosystem, and it signifies divine judgment on oppression.
But here, hanging on the Roman cross, the order of those elements is profoundly reversed. First, the blood flows out from the wound.
And in biblical theology, blood represents atonement. It represents the pouring out of life to satisfy the demands of divine justice.
And because the blood flows first, completing the work, it is immediately followed by clear water.
And water, throughout the entirety of the biblical narrative, signifies washing, baptism, and the sustaining of life.
It echoes Moses striking the rock in the barren wilderness and fresh water pouring out to save a desperate people from dying of thirst.
It is a total reversal of the ancient curse.
The judgment of the Egyptian plague is absorbed and satisfied by the blood, allowing the water to flow not as a mechanism of death, but as a mechanism of purification and endless life.
I have to interject here because that is an astonishingly complex literary reversal. Water to blood is a curse, blood to water is the cure.
It is brilliant.
But looking at the sheer density of these connections, does Wilhoit believe the author, John, was sitting there intelligently structuring his eyewitness account to create poetic reversals of Egyptian plagues and refute Greek philosophers? Or is this all a much later theological realization that theologians have just layered over the text?
That tension is the perpetual debate among historians and theologians. Did a traumatized eyewitness record a bizarre biological anomaly and only decades later realize its profound symbolic resonance?
Right.
Or is the narrative carefully constructed after the fact to serve these theological ends? Wilhoit's position, pulling us all the way back to the concept of the golden milestone, is that the divine author orchestrated the physical, historical events on the ground to perfectly mirror the theological truths.
So in Wilhoit's view, the history and the symbolism are one and the exact same thing.
Which brings us right back to that opening image of the Roman Forum.
Because what Wilhoit's sermon ultimately does is take every granular, seemingly chaotic detail of this historical Friday. The ticking clock of the setting sun, the dark psychological irony of the unleavened bread,
The intact skeletal structure of a crucified man, and the exact sequence of bodily fluids flowing from a spear wound.
and he argues with absolute conviction that none of it is an accident.
It is a meticulously orchestrated blueprint. Every single purity law, every ancient festival, every obscure prophecy we've discussed acts as a paved road, and they all deliberately converge on this single center point in human history.
And the relevance for you, listening to this deep dive today, isn't just about walking away with a better understanding of ancient architecture or, the mechanics of religious history.
No, it's far more personal.
The reason this text has survived for millennia is that it connects to a deep, universal human craving. We all crave that true rest Wilhoit talked about on the sixth day.
We all desperately want to wash the slate clean.
To leave the leaven and the heavy baggage of our past behind. These ancient texts aren't just historical records. They are ultimately trying to address our most fundamental human anxieties about our worth, our exhaustion, and our need for peace.
They are offering a highly detailed map out of that exhaustion, pointing toward a very specific destination.
So we want to leave you with a final thought to chew on, something that builds on the architecture of this entire deep dive.
Think about your own life for a moment.
If this ancient text presents an entire historical, literary, and spiritual framework built around a single, immovable focal point, what about us? Look at your own life.
Think about your daily habits, your deep-seated anxieties, your frantic busyness trying to secure your future.
How many of the roads you're running down every single day are subconsciously pointing toward a center you haven't actually stopped to identify yet?
What are you actually building your life's architecture around?
When you trace all your actions back to their origin point, what is the golden milestone in your personal Roman forum? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.